Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event, and welcome to any new people this week. We also have people watching on Facebook and some who listen to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday on J-Air and Sundays at 4 p.m. At FM 88 in Melbourne or jair.com.au. Welcome to you all. My name's David Adler. I'm president of AJA. Alan Friedman, who normally MCs, is busy, so we have the other half of Nothing Left, Michael Bird, who's put his hand up to help out this evening. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, David.
You can also see on the screen our guest tonight, Ruthie Blum, who will introduce more formally in a moment. The format will be an interview-style discussion. We break for a quick promo for 1 minute and then questions. If you'd like to ask a question, the best way to do it is to raise your hand using the reactions function at the bottom of the screen. We will try to look at written questions, but being a little bit short when Robert Gregory's overseas travelling at the moment, we might have difficulty picking up. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. Okay, to Ruthie Blum. Many of us in the diaspora are watching the events in Israel with some concern and alarm, as people of a variety of types, some described as anarchists or left-wing agitators, seem to be hell-bent on disrupting Israel. While some of the protesters might be well motivated, we hear stories about how it's being organised, some irresponsible incitement, including from senior politicians, is creating a bit of a dangerous, unpleasant environment. So what's actually happening? What are the concerns? Are they real? How big a deal are these protests? Who funds them and organises them? These are some of the things that we want to cover. Ruthie Blum is a well-known American-Israeli journalist, columnist, author. She's been involved in a whole variety of publications. Ruthie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
For those that are not familiar with you, can you describe your current work? What are you doing?
I write regularly for the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and the Jerusalem Post. I have a weekly column in the Jerusalem Post. And I lecture and I edit and I translate and do various things.
Okay. Now, so let's get into the issue. What is the focus of the protests, the proposed judicial reforms? And if so, can you give us a quick overview of what the issue is, what the concerns are?
Well, the protest movement ostensibly began to oppose judicial reform by the new government in Jerusalem. But it mushroomed. First of all, that wasn't really the root of the protest movement. The root of the protest movement was disgruntlement with the results of the November 1st Knesset elections.
Right.
And a coalition, quite unprecedented actually, of all right-wing parties, right-wing and religious parties. And this is a source of shock and horror, not only to the left, certainly to the left, but also to others who call themselves centrists. The reason I say call themselves is that I consider myself a centrist. I think Likud is the center. So it all depends where you draw the center, all right? But if you take, for example, the politician Benny Gantz, he's considered center, while Yair Lapid, the opposition leader, is to the left of him, etc. And the Labour Party leader is far left. Now, if we want to talk about judicial reform, why is there hysteria? Now, either we talk about it as the issue itself, or we talk about it in a broader sense. The broader sense is that the judicial reform will remove what some people call the left-wing deep state, will remove the power of Israel's deep state. And what does that mean? The unprecedented power of the Supreme Court in Israel has made it, has created a situation in which even when the right is in power, even when the right wins an election, or there is a more majority of right-wing parties in a coalition, the left dominates the all legislation. Now, this is a situation that the current government is trying to rectify, and not just left and right. It's trying to restore the balance of powers between the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive branches.
Ruthie, how do you respond to the slogans, the allegations that Israel is about to become an undemocratic autocracy or something like that if the proposed reforms are implemented? What's your view on those allegations?
In a word, nonsense. Israel is not going to become a dictatorship or a fascist theocracy. That's not Israel's nature, and it won't happen. And this government has no intention of making that happen. And the reforms that are on the table suggest nothing of the sort. So this brings us to why many people are protesting in the streets, most of whom have no clue what's in those reforms. And they're very sort of basic and logical ones. A couple of points of them are controversial, but that's exactly where negotiating comes in, or could come in, if both sides actually wanted to reach an agreement. But the left does not want to reach an agreement. It wants to cancel the reforms. It wants to prevent them, from going through. But the bulk of the protesters, and the protest movement seems to be mushrooming because it's already reached all the sectors, high-tech sector, and the elite units of the army, et cetera, et cetera. If you pay attention to the protests and you see the signs being waved and you listen to people being interviewed, very few even mention judicial reform except as an afterthought. What they say is the ultra-Orthodox are taking over the country, both demographically and politically. They say this government won't create a Palestinian state. They say judicial reform will trample women's rights. As a result, there's a group of women who walk around in these protests wearing Handmaid's Tale outfits, which, by the way, are extremely expensive. And this brings us to another question you asked about funding. Who's funding this? These protests really are very, very well organized. It's enough to say, you know, on Thursday, we're going to have countrywide protests and people show up, et cetera, et cetera. Well, one group that actually has taken credit for giving money to the protesters is the New Israel Fund, which is a far left so-called human rights organization.
Yeah, they're quite active here, Ruthie. We're familiar with their...
Right. Now, when I've said that the New Israel Fund is funding a lot of this, I was accused of being a conspiracy theorist, but actually the New Israel Fund is happy to take credit for it. And if you look on the New Israel Fund website, you'll see that. Secondly, the US State Department. Now, interestingly, it's not that the US State Department is directly funding protests. It's that the US State Department admits to, this is not something I'm inventing, to giving money to the movement for quality government in Israel. But that
I've heard of that
to
group.
be a left-wing organization as well. So money, and you know how money is fungible. This is how often, even if you say we're not going to give money for Palestinian terrorism, it gets there anyway. Because, you know, you can be donating to something and then that group decides where it goes, you see. So
I read something that I guess you could call a conspiracy theory, but you're almost saying that it's part true. It went like this. The Biden-Obama administration is active here. We know that Obama did try to interfere in Israeli politics in the past. He funded experts. They even went as far as to say the CIA are involved in some way. So you think the involvement is essentially funding some of these left-wing organisations, empowering them, or could it be more than that?
I don't want to hurl accusations that I don't have facts to back up. But I will say that it is very clear, we know for a fact that the Obama administration was not happy with having a Netanyahu-led government in Israel. This is no secret. It's not a secret. We know. Now, we know that the Biden administration is made up with many of the same, if not all the same, actual people, but certainly has its ideology. So Biden, as much as he says, yes, I'm old friends with Bibi Netanyahu, it's true, he's known him for many years, and I'm sure that on a personal level, they're very cordial, etc. And it is also true that Biden doesn't have a history of being some kind of, radical leftist anti-Semite or something like that. But he heads the Democratic Party, which has moved farther and farther to the left. And it really doesn't matter whether Biden is a radical leftist or not. His party is, also blackmailed culturally and politically by those left-wing forces. And that brings us back to Israel again. Don't forget that one of the problems that I think Jews outside of Israel, or Jews who do care about Israel, okay? When they say they're pro-Israel and they mean it, and I'm not talking about the radical leftists who accuse Israel of all kinds of war crimes. Regular liberal Jews. I think they don't realize the collusion. I don't like that word, so I'll think of it. Partnership is a better word, between the Israeli left and the left wing outside of Israel. Now, it's not even a secret that Yair Lapid, who was prime minister for 5 minutes and now is head of the opposition, is encouraging Jewish organizations. I know that about in the United States, I can't say about Australia, but I wouldn't be surprised, to go against the government in Israel. Now think about that. You have the high-ranking politicians in Israel appealing to groups abroad to denounce their government in Israel. Now, this isn't new. The late Shimon Peres used to do that. He would go across America and basically say, for example, that the government headed by Menachem Begin is terrorists, et cetera, et cetera. So this phenomenon isn't new, but this is happening now. So what you have is a kind of circular effort. So on the one hand, you have Israelis who are saying to American Jews, help us, Israel's going to become a dictatorship. And those Jews say, oh my God, this is terrible. We've got to help the opposition in Israel to preserve Israeli democracy. Now, it's a big, big, fat lie, but not everybody who believes it is ill-willed or is a liar himself.
Yeah, they can just be not well informed. It's not their main game.
Yes, they're not well informed, and also, they're useful idiots for the Israelis who are trying to topple this government.
So you mentioned a couple of the leaders, Ruthie. In case people here are not aware, there has been some quite outrageous incitement or threats. Can you mention a couple of those so that people get the flavour for what's happening there?
Well, I can give you one example from the demonstration that happened a week ago. There were men and women in the street interviews, and one woman said, Yariv Levine, the justice minister, who is orchestrating, well, he's not the only person orchestrating the judicial reforms, but anyway, he's the justice minister and he's a Likud member. She said, Yariv Levine even looks like a Nazi because he has blue eyes. Look at him. He looks just like those Nazis. Now, this is an educated Israeli protester in the streets of Tel Aviv.
Amazing.
That's one example. So there's many, many Nazi comparisons. What has happened is these protests have become a mishmash of left-wing ideologies. And so judicial reform becomes like sidelined. And believe me, listen, I'll liken this to the same issue with why the Palestinians don't have a state. All of these years, all of these decades, Israeli governments have been saying, okay, so we're negotiating, right? We're negotiating towards a two-state solution. So the Palestinians say, no, unless you go back to the 67 borders, there is no negotiating. Or fine, give us territory, and then we're gonna launch a terrorist, an intifada. The point is that when both sides are not aiming at the same thing, then the side with the goodwill is at a loss because the other side is not interested in reaching an agreement. The other side is aimed at destroying it.
Ruthie, I've seen pictures of protests with the Palestinian flag.
Yeah.
Who's carrying them? Who's bringing those flags, and what point are they trying to make?
No, actually, it's interesting because I would say the Palestinian flags at the moment anyway are in a minority at these demonstrations. And it's an interesting story how this happened. The initial demonstrations a few weeks ago had quite a few Palestinian flags. They were brought by left-wing groups. There were also
By Jews?
What? Yes, Jews.
Jewish Israelis are carrying the Palestinian.
There are no Arabs taking part in these protests. The Arabs basically think that both the opposition and coalition in Israel are both, Zionist pigs. So no, they're not taking part in these demonstrations. It's all Jews. So the Jews they were carrying Palestinian flags and gay pride flags as well, all kinds of things like that. And the organizers of the protests actually said, look, the more Palestinian flags you bring to these protests, the worse it looks for us because we're trying to save, Israeli democracy. And if we look like we're, all we're doing is waving Palestinian flags, it does our cause harm. So the funders of these protests, if you notice, if you take a look at all the photos and all the videos, the Israeli flags that everyone is waving are identical. In other words, it's not that everyone went out to the store and bought his own flag, right? These flags are being handed out by the organizers and they cost a lot of money. Think what it costs to have hundreds of thousands of flags printed up that are exactly the same. So it wasn't until there was a lot of suggestion that the far left are the only people at these demonstrations. So now if you watch a demonstration, what you will see is tons of Israeli flags. And they were saying, you see, we are good Zionists. We just want to save our country. And it's a propaganda tool. As I said, listen, Israel's Independence Day every year, you never see so many flags, certainly not by the secular elite in Israel. And certainly not, even when you do see Israeli flags, they're different sizes, they're different shapes, some are little, some are big, these flags at these protests are identical in size. They're all the poles that hold them are the same. That's not an accident.
Yeah.
David, I'd like to.
Michael, I know you've got a couple of questions. Go for
it. Ruthie, we had Naftali Bennett here last week. He spoke, I was at an event he spoke, there was about 800 people at his event in Melbourne. He spoke in Sydney as well. When asked about this judiciary controversy, he basically said, yes, there needs to be changes. The judiciary shouldn't, the government shouldn't be run from the bench. There has been some controversial issues which the judiciary shouldn't have interfered with, but he says he doesn't want it to go too much the other way. But he at least admits that there needs to be changes. Even left-wing President Herzog has, I'm reading just today and yesterday, he's saying there should be some sort of compromise. What is the compromise on either side? What is the current government willing to compromise? And what is the opposition and all the protesters? I mean, from what I'm reading, they want to keep the status quo. In other words, they want to keep the left-wing judiciary so they can overrule all the conservative issues.
If you leave
What
out,
are the-
even, excuse me.
Yeah, so go on, tell us.
I was
Yeah.
saying, even if you leave out the word left-wing judiciary, okay? Because the minute when you describe it like that, you obfuscate, what you do is you kind of play into the left's hands. Forget a minute about they want to leave a left-wing judiciary. They want to leave, that it's true, but what they want to do is leave, is continue to have the court reign supreme. And interestingly, many of the anti-government leaders of the anti-government movement were themselves judicial reformers, or previously had presented plans for judicial reform that were far more extensive than the current ones. And two politicians in particular are Avigdor Lieberman and Gidon Saar. And now they're all, oh, this is terrible. Yes, we need, it's terrible. What these people want is to topple this government. By the way, the thing that they also say, one of the slogans of this movement is majority rule is bad. Democracy doesn't end at the ballot box. These are the slogans of these people. So forget about which clauses of judicial reform are. There are many things that can be compromised in this bill, in these bills, many. And Justice Justice Minister Levine is willing to. As I said, it's Yair Lapid, who is the head of the opposition, and Benny Gantz has joined forces with him to say, no, until you put a halt to all the proceedings, we're not going to talk to you. And the reason is, by the way, there has been plenty of time to come to the table to negotiate. There's a law, constitution, and justice committee. During those meetings, those are the times. During the Knesset's plenum, those are the times to have these debates. But instead, the opposition is banging on the table, singing, this is our country. It's a propaganda effort that is actually working on people who don't know anything about what's in the bills.
What do you say to the allegation that it just wants to help Bibi get off his legal issues by softening the judiciary, and the other allegation of becoming an orthodox state and a religious state? On those two particular, you keep hearing those two particular allegations.
Ridiculous and more ridiculous. Netanyahu's trial, although it is really the prosecution's case, is falling apart all the time. I mean, so forget about my opinion about the proceedings themselves. It can't get him off his trial. There's nothing in these bills that would do that. Nothing. Okay. He's on trial. It'll take another 2 years or something because of this insane, because there are hundreds of witnesses and all that. So that it's totally, that's a lie. Okay. If these reforms go through, it has nothing to do with Netanyahu's trial. Number two, Israel will never become an ultra-Orthodox state. It is a pluralistic state. It always has been. In fact, let me point out to all the people who say, oh, demographically, it's all ultra-Orthodox. First of all, let's I have become extremely uncomfortable with the anti-Semitic undertones and overtones of such statements, okay? It really is, if any non-Jew said such things about the Haredim, we would all scream about anti-Semitism. I am offended the way the Orthodox are spoken about in this country, number one. Number two, I'm a secular Jew. I'm a woman. I don't know, I live in Tel Aviv. I'm all those things that supposedly would make me a left winger, and I'm on the right. In all, I have been in Israel for decades, for going on 5 decades. And the more the ultra-Orthodox population grows, because they have many children, the more the population grows, the more religious Israel gets, the more secular it gets. When I first came to Israel in 1977, there were hardly any non-kosher restaurants in Jerusalem, for sure not. In Tel Aviv, a few. It was now today, there are things open on Shabbat. There are non-kosher restaurants everywhere. There are private minibuses on Shabbat. There are movies, there are plays, there are whatever. It is a ridiculous assertion that Israel is going to become some kind of theocratic state.
David? Okay, Ruthie, just one more thing before David comes back. The Jewish diaspora are turning on Israel. We have the Zionist Federation here that issued, in my view, a shocking one-sided statement, basically, condemning the Israeli government and the threat of democracy, etc. No mention of what happened to the Prime Minister's wife, the attack that she came under, all the violence in the demonstrations. Once these were Israeli advocacy organizations, now they're becoming the opposite, and they're doing our enemies a favor. How do you see that, looking from Israel out to because I think the same thing's happening in America?
Okay, first of all, let me say that Jews, as we know, always tend to be on the more liberal side of the political spectrum. This is nothing new. That's first of all. So that's true of America and Britain and it's true everywhere. Now, when you said these used to be pro-Israel advocacy organizations, well, they were, but their own people, their like-minded people were in power when they were pro-Israel advocacy. So if you think about it, before 1967, the 1967 Six-Day War, campus advocacy for Israel among Jews and even non-Jews was very, very high. Okay, Israel was a hero. As soon as the war ended, that started to shift. Okay, and the whole business of occupation and illegal occupation, et cetera, Now, when Menachem Begin came to power in 1977, all of the things you're talking about happened again. It happened with the Jews outside of Israel and the left in Israel. They said Begin is Mussolini, he's Hitler, he's a terrorist. There were violent fights on the Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University campuses between pro-Begin and anti-Begin demonstrators. Now, you wouldn't know this because today, even the left says, oh, the Likud of the days of Menachem Begin had integrity. The people who say that, I'd like to remind them what they said when he came to power, when Begin came to power. Okay, and the same thing with Ariel Sharon when he came to power. But as soon as Ariel Sharon said, okay, we're going to disengage from Gaza, the entire left wing in Israel said, okay, we got to protect him. We've got to make sure he's going to carry this out. And Jews abroad suddenly stopped calling Ariel Sharon a terrorist as well. What you're seeing now, when you have Jewish groups turning against the government, it's because Netanyahu is the politician that the left in Israel loves to hate, the way they hated Begin, the way they hated Sharon before Sharon flipped. So of course the Jewish groups identify today with the opposition in Israel. It's not that, so they'll say we still are pro-Israel. What they mean is we're still pro-Labor Party and whatever else you want to call the left. Okay, there are a lot of different names for parties. And by the way, that is why the left came to love Naftali Bennett, who joined it, who created a coalition with the left and an Arab party that is part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And suddenly all the left-wingers who called Naftali Bennett a fascist, suddenly, oh, he's wonderful and we have a pluralistic state. That's what's happening. Jews are liberals and they prefer when there's a left-wing government in Jerusalem.
David?
Okay, thank you. I'll do the 1 minute promo and then we'll open for questions. As we do each week, we ask people to please support AJA. At the end of this event, if you're not yet a member, go to the website jewishassociation.org.au. You can make a donation there. Make sure you're following the AJA Facebook page, which is usually updated 3 or 4 times a day with latest news and views. Now, next week, we've got another top flight commentator, Peter Bowen, who's going to be addressing a question that we will have a great deal of fun with. What is a Palestinian? And this little guy here is pointing out that there's been 200 years of archaeological excavation and not a single ancient piece of that demonstrates a Palestinian people. So we'll take a slightly more academic approach next week, something that Peter has researched, how this has evolved. So we have a few questions I can see, quite a few. I'll remind you to please keep them as brief as possible and don't make speeches. Ron, if you can unmute, you've got the first slot. Ron, can you unmute? There you are. Off you go.
Okay. Good evening. Hello, Ruth. Ruthie, it's nice to see you. In Australia, there's quite a lot of debate going on regarding a forthcoming referendum about giving Aboriginals a voice to Parliament, and they've specifically said that foreign donations are banned from for being used in this Australian issue. Why doesn't Israel do the same thing, since all these protests are funded from overseas?
Well, I don't have an answer for that. I know that we do have policies against foreign funding for things, but as I said, money is fungible. I guess it's hard to prove where it's going and when it's going. So, for example, there was nothing wrong with the movement for quality government in Israel receiving funds from outside because it's not a political party, etc. Okay, so probably the answer is that it has to do with loopholes and again, the Israeli courts.
Yep.
There we go again.
Okay, Terry, can you unmute and ask your question, please?
Good evening. What I'm seeing in Israel at the moment is what I've seen in a lot of Western countries over a long period of time. We saw big demonstrations when Trump was elected. We've seen the same with even Boris Johnson, God bless him. Surely, though, the fact is that what they're demonstrating against in Israel at the moment is a newly elected government, elected by a majority. Shouldn't that be the be-all and end-all of support or opposition? I mean, by all means, oppose the government, but at least do it on a basis of some sort of factual or policy base, rather than just getting out in the streets and screaming.
Yeah, it should be, and that's what all of us who elected this government have been saying. So the opposition is saying two things. One thing is that, well, it wasn't really a majority because this number of votes, they finagle some way of claiming it wasn't a serious majority. And the other thing they say is, so what if it's a majority? Hitler also rose to power with a democratic majority. This is their answer. So what? Majority rule is not such a good thing. They actually say it. I'm not making that up for Purim.
Amazing. Okay, Hugh, can you unmute and ask your question, please?
Hi, Ruthie from England. We've got snow on the ground here.
Wow.
Bibi Netanyahu is brilliant and articulate in expressing why he's doing something. He's been more or less silent on this. Am I right in thinking that he's got a gag order against him? And if so, what's behind that?
You are right. He does have a gag order. And ironically, he is the one most likely to be able to succeed at reaching a compromise. He was forbidden, get this, by the Attorney General from talking about anything related to judicial reform due to what she claims is a conflict of interest because he's on trial. It is this kind of travesty of justice whereby the Attorney General in Israel is not the government's lawyer, but the government's boss. And this happened just by, it was a power grab that began in the 90s by the Supreme Court President Aaron Barak. And the Attorney General role is one of the parts of the judicial reform that we're trying to shift, by the way. In any case, he's not allowed to talk about it.
Amazing. Now, the next one is just named Galaxy S10 Plus. If you know that's your login, you can unmute and ask your question.
Good morning, Moshe Trebish from Jerusalem. In terms of one of the what seems to be a very serious problem coming forward is the growth in the size of the Haredi community and their relation to the workforce. Now, there's been some movements to try and have core studies being introduced to their school, and Bibi finished up making a coalition agreement with them where basically that's gone out the window and they are getting support for their current education system, quite significant support, probably maybe perhaps a little bit different to what's given to other children, and not to have those studies that just basically can carry on with just doing the Jewish religious studies. Do you have a view on that, please?
Well, of course, I support core curriculum for all children so that they have the same opportunities as other children. Okay, let's say that's my end goal. Although I will say, as the mother of 4 Israeli children who went through the school system in the secular system, it was appalling. The core studies they received at home more than in the schools, thanks to terribly low salaries for teachers, for one thing. So attracting good teachers was hard, but also there was a real left-wing agenda at the time, many years ago, that was seeping in my kids' schools. So I wanted to say that the core curriculum for all children in Israel could use a lot of improvement, okay? It's not only Haredi kids who aren't learning the multiplication table. So let me just make that clear, right? Number 2, every coalition agreement requires compromise. And let me make it clear that had Yair Lapid, had the results of the election been such that Yair Lapid had the same number of mandates as Netanyahu's Likud, in a flash, he would have made the similar deals with the Haredi parties. Let's make it clear, we've seen this throughout Israel's history. So all of the screaming about the Haredim and what they're doing to society They have political power because they are a considerable number, that's democracy. They have an interest group, they get elected, their politicians get elected, etc., just like other politicians. Having said that, there is also a lot of misinformation spread about them, about how many are in the workforce and how many are in the army. And as I said, the propaganda against the Haredi community in Israel borders on, or not only borders on, anti-Semitism out and out.
Wow. Ruthie, you're not known for mincing your words, and that was a very strong example. Morris Klein, please unmute.
Ruthie, your most recent article, the Chief of Staff Halevi should call his troops to order. An excellent, most alarming article. These reservists are buying into this, the judicial issues. Serious, a large number of doing it. Could you ever foresee that they would disobey a direct order? You know, the refusal.
Right, first of all, it's not so, okay. First of all, it's not such a large number. Let's make that clear. Okay. Number two, so far they haven't refused orders. Some of them said they're not gonna volunteer in reserves or go to certain exercises. We'll see what actually happens. Third, if the Chief of Staff of the Army does not court-martial or penalize anybody for behaving like that, then he's to blame. And fourth, let me say that most of the soldiers, you notice the ethnic, so let's put it this way, socioeconomic level of the reservists who have been publishing these letters and petitions and showing up. They are all from good, upper middle class, elite families, mostly Ashkenazi. Why I'm saying this is if you go to and that's certainly true of the pilots in the Air Force, the fighter pilots. The fighters in infantry and other soldiers, border police, have come out in droves to say, we will never disobey orders. We will serve whenever we're called to do so. There is a troubling issue here, and it is also relevant to the makeup of the Supreme Court, which is extremely homogeneous. They appoint one another. They're all from the same upper crust. They all went to the same law school. It's very, in a way, if you think about it, it's a little like Britain, but if you didn't go to Eton, if you look at the politicians who succeed, they all went to the same schools, etc. Now, Aaron Barak, the retired Supreme Court president, was interviewed a couple of weeks ago, and he came out and when asked, why is the Supreme Court so homogeneous? Why are the judges all from the same, the same old boys network, so to speak? His answer, without blinking, was, well, we tried to find Moroccan judges, but we couldn't find any. It was really an appalling statement, but it was very revealing. And the same is true of the Israel Air Force. And, part of what the reforms need to do is sweep across society and let the voices of the voters, who are actually the majority, also take their part, be more prominent in the military and in the courts.
Ruthie, you almost touched on something that was in a written question I noticed, and that is there an Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Sephardi division happening here? What's the dynamic?
Well, there's always been one to some extent. I mean, it used to be worse, I think, it was certainly in the early days of the state. And today, because there's so much intermarriage, I mean, I hate to call it intermarriage when it's all Jews, but it's hard to say who's Ashkenazi and who's Sephardi when, I don't know, my own grandchildren are mixed up and all my friends have one parent like this and one parent like that, etc. So you can't really you can't really only divide it by Ashkenazi, Sephardi, or Mizrahi. It's more like a class struggle. It's the elite versus the lower elite. Now, as it happens, many more Mizrahim are not in the elite. That is true, you could say. But this is much more about class, because if you're a Mizrahi who identifies with the left and goes to the right schools and presents himself or herself in the acceptable way, he right away moves over into the elite category. The same thing is happening in America. If you are a Black in America who's a member of the Republican Party or a woman, you no longer are given the same warm bath by the left that screams about discrimination against women and Blacks. That I would say happens in Israel too, yes.
Yeah, okay. Eva Lowy, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
It's Eva Lowy's husband, Tony, here. Look, this upheaval's going on too long. Historically, nation states and empires destroy themselves from within.
True.
It's what's happening here. So members of the IDF, tech, other groups, too many Jewish people all over the world, together with the anti-Semites across the world and in Israel, it's sort of going, it's worrisome. So I don't know what Herzog can do, but it's another example of an empire or a state destroying itself from within. So Ruthie, what do you think can happen to try to block this destruction, because it's going on quite long and troublesome?
Well, I wish I had an answer for that. I don't. At the moment, my feeling is once these reforms go through, my feeling is that maybe the hysteria will die down. That's what I'm hoping, of course. The other thing I would say is that what you're talking about has been historically the case with the Jewish people, since the Bible. So some people might think that we're headed for a destruction of this is going to be yet again another destruction of the temple. I don't see that happening, but I think this is just a more extreme version of internal strife that Jews have periodically. They have it all the time politically. And so, I wish I had an answer. I think God only knows. But I will say that it's a shame that outside of Israel, people are buying the propaganda. It's a well-oiled propaganda machine that is lying about what's going on here now, lying about what the government is doing, I mean. And it's a shame that so many people are persuaded. And if you were to just step back for a second, you want to tell me that any Israeli, seriously, any Israeli who lives here actually believes the nonsense that this is about to turn into a dictatorship? Really? It's false. It's false. I don't think they even believe it themselves. I've heard this over the years millions of times. And as I said, when Begin rose to power, they were saying the same thing. Did Israel become a dictatorship? On the contrary.
Yeah. Okay. So where do you see it going? What do you think will happen over the next few weeks?
Well, there's talk of a compromise. President Herzog has been trying to broker this. The Likud is saying, fine, come to talk to us. There are certain elements of the reform that they're willing to compromise on because there are certain details that can be compromised on. Whether the other side will come and agree to that is not clear. And I believe that it is going to be settled one way or the other. It will be settled because if there is no compromise, the bills are going through as scheduled. The Knesset has a majority for the right that supports these reforms. So there's the first reading in committee, the second reading, then it goes to the Knesset, then it goes. These bills are going to pass. So if the oppositionists don't get their act together and try to bargain for a little better of a deal, let's say, over the reforms, they're going to go through as they are now, as they're written.
Right. Okay. Look, we take the view here that it's a bit of a chutzpah for us on the other side of the world to be judging internal events in Israel. And look, as Jews, we obviously take a great deal of interest. But there used to be, until very recently, an ethical principle for the diaspora that if you want to get involved in the internal politics of Israel, you can. The entry price is aliyah. How do you feel about, that attitude? We can comment on policy, but to actually try to intervene on the internal politics, really, it's not appropriate when you're on the other side of the world. You have a law of return, and you can make aliyah if you want to.
Well, look, I think, especially in this day and age of the internet, and that it's really hard to ask people, Jews or non-Jews, to not have a strong opinion about what's going on in Israel, the way I have strong opinions about what goes on in America. Now, it's true, I have American citizenship, but I haven't lived in America for decades, okay? So you could say that I also shouldn't intervene in what happens in America. It's not realistic, okay? So Jews have just as much a right to write what they want and say what they want about what's going on in Israel, because you can't stop it. And by the way, it's a little unfair to say that when both sides, both the right and left, say it or go against that principle, depending on when it suits them. Okay. Yeah. So for example, if you take attorney Alan Dershowitz was asked to give his opinion on Zoom in the Justice, Law and Constitution Committee that just took place last week in a session on Zoom. So, I mean, it's a little hard to say people shouldn't intervene or express their opinions in op-eds in the New York Times if you're going to ask experts from outside of the country to weigh in, especially Jewish experts.
Yeah. Okay, I was going to leave it to later, but I'll say it now that I've just received an email that Jair and with David Schulberger's moderator are organising a discussion. I guess it'll be a much more legal, technical discussion involving Alan Dershowitz and Eugene Kontonovich, who are both professors of law who have somewhat different perspectives. And that'll be in about a week, and we'll put out a notice to inform people about that. Saul, you got in just in time. You get the last question for tonight.
Thank you very much indeed. I was going to ask how the judges are appointed, but that already Ruthie had answered that. So can I ask another question? Ruthie, do you think that it would help if Israel actually had a written constitution that the judges could then look at and see, yes, this law is in accord with the Constitution, or no, it is against the Constitution? But at least there's some statute that they can look at and see that is really final.
Okay, so first of all, that's a good question, and I'm not sure I'm of two minds of that, but I will say one thing. In the Israeli Declaration of Independence, it says that a constitution will be written within, now I forget the amount of time, but it was supposed to be within months or something of the establishment of the state. And at the time, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, said, we don't have time to deal with writing a constitution, which takes a lot of thought and a lot of discussion. We have a state to build. We have enemies around us. We can't deal with that now. Okay, that's what happened in 1948. And since then, repeated attempts or many people and academics have said, okay, now we need a constitution. Now we need a constitution. Well, in the 1990s, Justice Aaron Barak came along and said, our Constitution are these basic laws, so what are called basic laws, and we will rely on those as our Constitution. The reason I don't know how to answer you about whether having a Constitution would solve the problem is that if judges are totally a homogeneous bunch, what is to say that what's written in the Constitution they wouldn't interpret in a way that, see, today they have something called the reasonableness. They rely on something, they say, well, it's not reasonable, which is a made up Israeli left-wing thing that it doesn't exist anywhere else, to determine, okay, well, maybe it's legal, but it's unreasonable. That's what the Supreme Court justices can do today. If there were a constitution right now, given the way judges are appointed and the kind of judges that sit on the court, I'm not sure it would solve that, because as you said, it's a question of interpreting the law, not just having it, the letter of the law. And we see that in America, there are big fights over what the Constitution means in certain clauses.
Michael, do you want to say anything before we close?
Yes, Ruthie, I think it's safe to assume that the majority of the protesters are generally left wing, and the one thing in common is they're all anti-Bibi.
That's for sure.
Would you say that's the one thing that they've all got in common? So it's
yes, definitely.
So a lot of it's got to do with they're just not happy with the recent elections. And
absolutely.
So do you think they're calling for a civil war? Do you think, or do you think that's at the extreme?
Well, yes, because what they're doing, what they're doing is, instead of calling for things, they're warning against them. They're saying, if this goes through, there will be civil war. The economy will be destroyed. Women's rights will be abolished. So what does that mean when they say that? They are calling for civil war, yes. They're trying to make it happen. And the only way this government is going to fall is if one of its members, one of the parties, pulls out of it. That's how it'll fall. These demonstrations will not make it fall. Okay. And that's all. What'll happen, and it could happen, that it could fall if, for example, let's suppose the government compromises too much on certain clauses in the reforms. It could be that the Shas party will say, well, sorry, this wasn't in our agreement with you. Or members of Likud, we don't know, could say, this isn't what I signed up for, and they could exit. That's the only way this government will fall. I don't believe that's going to happen. And I hope it's not going to happen. But the demonstrations are not going to cause that to happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruthie.
Okay, thank you, Ruthie, so much for joining us tonight and leading a very interesting discussion and informative. If people want to keep in touch with your work, what's the best way of doing so?
Well, I post everything on Facebook, Ruthie Blum on Facebook, Twitter, but my columns appear in jns.org and
Good service.
on jpost.com as well.
Okay. And just before we go, a reminder that the L'Chaim program with Morris Klein on 3ZZZ FM 92.3 or 3ZZZ.com.au is about to start. We will send a notice round about the discussion between the two legal academics within a few days. And that's all we have for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to keep up to date by following AJA, particularly on the Facebook page and our other social media, and make sure you've subscribed to the email list. So thank you all, and until next week when we discuss the fascinating question of what is a Palestinian, good night to all.